Good afternoon and thanks for tuning in. Are you a writer, movie maker, game master, or storyteller of any kind? If so, you're in the right place. Welcome to Wordcraft, exploring the realm of fantasy fiction. But you don't have to be into fantasy to get value from this lecture. The things I'm about to discuss will help any storyteller of any type make their craft stronger and more engaging to your audience. In this lecture, you can expect to learn the history of the fantasy genre, as well as some of the more common tropes, archetypes, and clichés commonly found in storytelling. And lastly, I'll break down what it is about fantasy that makes it so unique and why so many people continue to love it, even after all of this time. My name's Levi Samuel, and I've been writing and publishing novels for over a decade. But I fell in love with the fantasy genre long before I wrote my first book. Since the dawn of man, the need for escapism has been a driving force for our species. Cavemen wrote stories on the wall, telling tales, whether fact or fiction, of man versus beast, man versus man, or man versus environment. When the population was thin and the vast majority of the world remained unknown, tales would drift from one place to another by way of traveler. No matter how outlandish, many of these stories were taken as fact. Most people had no way of learning the truth, and therefore believed what they were told. This is the inspiration of much of the early mythology found around the world. Distance and Teller may have altered some of the details, but many of the stories remain the same. As exploration of the world became widespread, many of the stories drifted from fact to fiction, but it didn't stop new stories from filling the void. The more we, as a culture, expanded, the more we imagined places beyond our reach. This led to the creation of the lost or hidden world fantasy genre, which often involves the discovery of unknown worlds out of time, place, or sometimes both. As remnants of lost civilizations around the world were being discovered, imagination soared with the possibility of new places untouched by civilized man. Archaeological finds in Egypt's Valley of the Kings, the semi-mythical stronghold of Troy, the jungle-shrouded Mayan pyramids, they all raised unanswered questions which fueled the drive to know more. More was often provided in the form of stories and plausible explanations, which became more appealing with each retelling. Many of the mythical kingdom stories, such as El Dorado or Atlantis, fall into this genre. These stories have been an inspiration throughout the centuries, even impacting stories such as Harry Potter or the Dresden Files, which contain worlds of magic hidden just out of sight. More impressive, they continue to grow with tales of hidden utopias and lost kingdoms beneath the surface of our planet, hidden away from modern technology. From 1200 to 1600, tales of knights and high society were circulated as what we know as the classic romance literature. This is the time when the Arthurian legends became widely popular. So much of them blended with history that there's no telling what's true and what is not. This is also the time period where many of the trends we currently recognize as elements of fantasy, such as dragons, knights, and magic, were first written into literature. From 1600 to 1800, the Age of Enlightenment, otherwise known as the Age of Reason, was a time of unprecedented optimism for the potential growth of knowledge and reason. It was a period of rigorous scientific, political, and philosophical discourse that characterized European society until the end of the Napoleonic Wars. With all fields of knowledge subject to the unrelenting critical examination, writers of the time were able to openly express themselves in ways previously unavailable. As fantasy grew in popularity, so did its criticism. At the same time, a new literary genre emerged from the larger Romanticism movement from the Enlightenment Age. Characterized by expressions of terror, gruesome narratives, supernatural elements, and dark picturesque scenery, Gothic literature saw many notable titles come to popularity. Bram Stoker's Dracula, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Charlotte Bonnet's Jane Eyre, Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, and of course the works of Edgar Allan Poe became the face of the genre. In the 1800s to 1900s, there was a re-emergence of fairy tale fantasy. In 1812 and again in 1815, the Brothers Grimm published the first collection of fantasy stories written towards engaging an audience for the purpose of marketing. The roots of what we know as fantasy became increasingly popular, though the boundaries of genre fiction did not yet exist. The most well-known examples of this are the works of Shakespeare, which had many fantastical elements, but they are not considered part of the fantasy genre. The genre as we know it today started to take shape in 1858 with Scottish author George MacDonald's Fantasies. This was considered the first fantasy book for adults. His 1872 novel, The Princess and the Frog, further pushed this transition. In 1894, another pioneer for modern fantasy was English poet William Morris, who introduced the idea of setting a story in an entirely self-contained world within his book The Wood Beyond the World. This is the primary element which many consider the staple of epic fantasy. This is also the time when many children's classics made their debut, including Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, released in 1865, Frank L. Baum's Wizard of Oz in 1900, and J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan in 1904, among many others. In 1923, the first issue of Weird Tales, a pulp anthology magazine, hit the newsstands. It wasn't the first of its kind, but it debuted some of the most iconic creators in the history of speculative fiction. Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan the Barbarian, Fritz Leiber, the creator of Fathard and the Grey Mouser, H.P. Lovecraft, the creator of the Cthulhu mythos. Lovecraft's contribution to the fantasy genre would lay the foundation for the subgenre of dark fantasy. At the same time, Howard and Fritz wrote more traditional fantasy, filled with magic and swords. By the 1930s, pulp sword and sorcery had become the dominant fantasy genre. During the same time, an Oxford professor by the name of J.R.R. Tolkien was hard at work writing a story about a little man named Bilbo Baggins. Released on September 1st, 1937, The Hobbit was an instant classic. With the release of The Lord of the Rings in 1954 through 1955, Tolkien's fantasy world of Middle-earth was the most extensive and realistic ever seen at the time. It changed everything, upping the bar for the depths and complexity that was possible for a fantasy story. But it also set the popular image of the genre that endures to this day. Before The Lord of the Rings made its impact, another Oxford professor published his first in-series children's novel about a group of siblings who would discover a magical world inside of a wardrobe. Clive Staples, otherwise known as C.S. Lewis, released the Chronicles of Narnia in 1950. What Lord of the Rings did for fantasy for adults, the Chronicles of Narnia did for children. Tolkien and Lewis are considered the fathers of modern fantasy. During the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, there were many imitators, most of which forgotten to time. Aided by the works of Ray Bradbury, Frank Herbert, Robert Heinlein, and Arthur C. Clarke, and shows such as Star Trek, Doctor Who, The Twilight Zone, and Star Wars, this is the period that science fiction began to claim mainstream acceptance. Among these grandmasters of storytelling, one would stand out that would eventually break the chains of mediocrity that had taken hold of the fantasy genre. If Tolkien and Lewis are the fathers of modern fantasy, then Ursula K. Le Guin is the mother. In 1969, she published the first book of the Earthsea cycle, A Wizard of Earthsea. It introduced a plot element that has since become a standard for the genre, namely a school of magic where potential wizards learn their trade. Moreover, this was the first instance in which magic had rules, limits, and consequences. In the 1970s, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson created a game company called TSR, now known as Wizards of the Coast, where they released the first edition of a game called Dungeons & Dragons. This event was huge for the fantasy genre. While players of D&D have the freedom to make their own adventures, the game creators decided to hire writers to create characters and tell adventures of their own. This spawned several series such as the Dragonlance series, created by Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weiss, and the Forgotten Realms, whose most well-known writer is R.A. Salvatore. The 1980s and 90s saw the debut of many big-named authors such as Robin Hobb, Terry Pratchett, and comic book writer turned novelist Neil Gaiman, who in 1996 helped pioneer the subgenre of urban fantasy with his novel Neverwhere. In 1982, with the release of a movie based on Conan the Barbarian, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger and James Earl Jones, publishers decided to hire people to write new adventures for the character. Chief among these was historical fiction author James Oliver Rigney Jr., better known as Robert Jordan. Jordan went on to write a total of 7 Conan books, but he was already planning his next project. A fantasy epic that would not only make him a household name, but would allow him to succeed where so many others had failed. Some would even say he arguably surpassed The Lord of the Rings. On January 15, 1990, writing under the pen name he used for the Conan novels, Robert Jordan released The Eye of the World. This was the first book in the Wheel of Time series. The next evolution of the genre came in 1997 with A Song of Fire and Ice. After spending the vast majority of his career as a mid-list author, George R.R. Martin became one of the most sought-after writers of modern day. Throughout the 90s and 2000s, the internet became more popular and widely available to residential housing. The introduction of online gaming targeted fans of the fantasy genre with games such as RuneScape, World of Warcraft, and many others. Paired with the numerous novel adaptations associated with many of these games, it was a grand time for readers of the fantasy genre. In 2012, the self-publishing industry had a major boom with the introduction of the Amazon Kindle and ebook expansion. This opened doors for many authors who had been struggling to get the traditional publishers to notice them. Now, without the gatekeepers to stop them, books and media across the board have continued to rise at an alarming rate, giving hundreds of thousands of authors and creators the chance to be the next big thing. Throughout this expansive compendium of contributions to the genre, it's worth noting that each generation is inspired by the previous. There's a direct link from one author to the next, forming a chain that stretches back to the beginning of the written word. By understanding this, you can apply your own inspirations and join the ever-growing pantheon of content creators. The big question is, what is fantasy fiction? Simply put, the fantasy genre is a marketing term used by publishers and stores in order to categorize an expectation of themes or events for potential customers. Fantasy is one of the few genres in which you can approach topics which are otherwise impossible to explain. There is an argument to be made that you could, as a writer or a storyteller of any kind, you can allow things to happen in your story even without being fantasy. With fiction itself, you are allowing a reader to experience situations that might otherwise be impossible. I'd like to give you a couple reasons why people like fantasy. And number one, it's because anything can happen. I don't really like that statement because the truth is anything can happen in any story. As a storyteller in general, you have a way of bending time to your will. You can make 100 years pass in the split of a second, or you can make 1 second last 100 pages, or last forever. It's probably not going to be the greatest story in either case, but as a storyteller, you have the ability to do that, regardless of spectrum. The thing is, with fiction in general, it is an escapism. It allows people to experience either harrowing or impossible situations that they will otherwise never experience, and allows them to do that from a relatively safe and comfortable location. Whether they're watching a movie or reading a book or playing a video game, it's allowing them to escape their own life and get into something else. Now, when it comes to fiction in general, it's the thrill of magic and sword fights and dragons and just all of this stuff that doesn't exist in other genres. Really, the most important and beautiful thing about fantasy is literally anything can happen. It is the only genre which is not restricted. You can have romance in your fantasy. You can have an action adventure. You can have a heist. You can have, any other story type out there. You can have it in a fantasy setting and it will still feel like it belongs. And that's really the thing that I believe most people connect with fantasy. One detail that all storytellers need to consider is the tropes, archetypes, and clichés commonly found in their genre. These plot elements can shape your story or ruin it depending on the execution. Before I begin, I'd like to provide a few term definitions to avoid confusion. A trope is a commonly used word, expression, theme, or other element which appears many times in many different places. It can be synonymous with the term cliché, though cliché is often viewed as negative, whereas trope tends to be an indifferent stance. It's simply a plot device which has been used enough to become recognizable. And then a cliché is any term, expression, phrase, theme, archetype, or trope which has appeared so often it's now considered overuse and therefore exhausted. Clichéd elements are generally discouraged, and many people openly express their dislike for them. An archetype is a pattern or model used as a foundation to create elements in similar design. Many archetypes have become tropes due to their overusage. When you use elements such as the chosen one, you're using an archetype. These types of story structures generally follow the same pattern regardless of the story they're told in. A reader will typically know what's going to happen next, even if they can't identify the archetype being used. This alone should tell you to be careful with how you use archetypes, especially those that have become tropes. A predictable story is often a poorly executed story. The terms trope, archetype, and cliché are often synonymous with one another. Keep in mind that any plot element, if executed well, will defy expectations and cease to be a cliché, trope, or an archetype. From this point forward, going on just to ease the explanation, anytime that I refer to tropes, archetypes, or clichés, I'm just going to call them tropes. Understand that there are minute differences between the three, and many times the three overlap each other, but just for ease of communication, I'm just going to use the one term. Tropes are common in many stories. They often feel like they belong, and almost anyone can recognize them when they appear, even if they don't know the name. It's these styles of storytelling which have circulated throughout history time and again, creating rules that often leave us feeling less than fulfilled if not played out as expected. This can create problems for your story. To avoid this, it's recommended if you're planning to use any of these tropes, do so in such a way that it becomes unrecognizable. This will allow you to use the trope without fear of reader retribution due to predictability. If applied correctly, they won't feel like the dreaded clichés that they are so often accused of being. I'd like to discuss a few of the more common tropes that we run across and kind of break down. I'll give you a few examples. Really, all of these, even though that they've been done to death in many stories, they still appear quite frequently in a lot of other stories. There's a reason that these things are used so commonly. Whether that is because it gets your character where they need to be for whatever they need to do, whether it's because it just makes the blending of the storytelling easy. After all, if a character had a happy home life, he'd have no reason to go on an adventure. By being alone in the world, you've cut all the ties that are keeping your character at home. Most of the time, a mentally stable and happy person doesn't want to go on an adventure. Why would you leave your family if everything's all good at home? We as people thrive adventure. But whenever that adventure comes with, just basically picking up everything and just leaving your family, your kids, leaving everything behind, a lot of times we have trouble doing that. And that's why so often a lot of these types of heroes are orphaned or, they usually have an aunt or an uncle or somebody, but usually that person doesn't last very long. If you have your characters alone in the world, they can pick up and leave easier than to do so when they have a family at home. And if they do have a family at home, that leaves problems in your way that you will have to deal with. Otherwise, it's going to just annoy the reader. The reader will be, well, why are they leaving their family? Sometimes they have to due to the story elements. They're leaving to protect their family, something like that. But you need to remember that that element still exists and you will have to come back to it. The Chosen One is basically a single character who has been selected due to prophecy or some other mystical reason. It is their job to defeat the bad guy. It's often the main antagonist who's instrumental in fulfilling some long-forgotten prophecy. It helps if the character is an orphan or in some way alone in the world. And they're often also skilled in some kind of manual labor, whether it be a blacksmith or a woodcutter or something like that. It's kind of par for the course. A couple examples of this would be Harry Potter, which he's not really skilled in any manual labor. He's just kind of the kid that nobody wanted in the Muggle world. Richard Cypher from Sword of Truth series or Legend of the Seeker TV show. Anakin Skywalker, he wasn't much of a laborer either, although he was a good mechanic. The next trope, the secret heir. This is typically an orphan or street rat who comes from nothing and discovers they're the heir to the great and powerful kingdom, treasure, or other valuable entity. Examples include All Surprise Royalty, Harry Potter, and Lone Star from Spaceballs. Another thing that this particular trope is known as is rags to riches. The person who in life really doesn't have anything, and then suddenly they are granted with some wealth that they never had. And it could be monetary, it could be that they're the heir to a kingdom. There's many things behind this, and a lot of times this person was separated from their family at birth or shortly thereafter due to the overtaking of their kingdom or some other nefarious plot. Number 3, the Evil Overlord. The Evil Overlord is usually the main antagonist of the story. Their sole purpose is to be evil for the sake of being evil. Their motives are usually to gain control over the world regardless of the cost. Examples include Lord Voldemort, Dark and Raw, Sauron, the Emperor. The bad guy is bad for the sake of being bad. The reason this one is more of a cliche than a trope, you want to have highs and lows, and a lot of times if you're going to have a good, compelling story, you want your bad guy to be the good guy of their own story. Well, good and bad most of the time is perspective. Good and evil, on the other hand, not so much. It's the whole save a cat or kick a dog thing. The Evil Overlord, somebody who's bad simply for the sake of being bad, typically does not exist as far as human interactions go, or at least normal human interactions go. Most of the time, these people, the bad guy has their reasons for doing things. And it kind of ties into one of the later tropes we're going to cover. Next, the Reluctant Hero. This one, I believe, became a trope because it's one of the main foundation, the hero's journey story arc. The hero doesn't really want to go on the adventure. And I believe that's where this one spawns from. The Reluctant Hero is any character who doesn't want to undergo their quest to become a hero. They want life to return to normal and only continue their mission out of obligation or necessity. The Reluctant Hero is often also the chosen one. Examples include Luke Skywalker, Tony Stark from Endgame, Sam Winchester, and Ron Weasley. Samwise Gamgee would be another one. Frodo was willing to go, Sam really wasn't. He was forced into it. It's the person who's comfortable at home. They don't really want to go anywhere. The Lucky Novice. This is any character who can manifest great skill or talent having never practiced or honed their abilities before. These abilities are often associated with powers granted from being the chosen one. Examples include both Luke and Anakin Skywalker, Percy Jackson, Michael from Robert Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land, or Richard Cypher. These are people who just suddenly have abilities without any rhyme or reason behind it. Now, a lot of times, rhyme and reason will be explained later, but these abilities just magically appear. Number 6, the Wise Wizard, also known as the Mentor. The Wise Wizard is often an old and powerful character who assists the protagonist throughout the story. They often leave before the story's climax, forcing the protagonist to continue alone. This character is often the only person who knows of the existence of the Chosen One or the secret heir. Examples include Gandalf, Dumbledore, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Merlin, Aslan, and Zedeckis Zulzerander. The Wise Wizard is pretty much in any type of story. You're going to have the mentor type character who shows up and tells your hero that they're a part of something bigger and kind of drags them out into the story. It's a way to get them doing something, and it can be overdone, but if done right, it doesn't feel like a cliche or a trope. And some people change this, like it'll be a female instead of an old white dude. There's many different ways to get around any of these. It's really just a matter of creativity. Number 7, the powerful artifact. Any object of great power that must be kept out of the wrong hands It's often the source of strife as the protagonist attempts to protect the world by keeping it from the antagonist. Examples include the One Ring, the Book of Counted Shadows, the Allurn Medallion, basically just any magical item that, if it gets into the wrong hands, it's going to be bad for everybody. And a lot of times, if you're clever in your storytelling, you will show what happens when this thing is in the wrong hands, and then have it stolen so the protagonist can have it and keep it from the bad guy. It's really just a storytelling device. Number 8, the quest. The hero and his friends must set out on a specific quest with a set goal. The goal can range from saving a princess, defeating a villain, destroying a corrupt artifact, or finding someone. The goal is irrelevant. It's about the quest the character is undergoing and the objective of their mission rather than the more important inner journey. Examples include Percy Jackson, Lord of the Rings, The Sword of Truth, and Star Wars. These stories are not always about the character growing as a person. They do in a little bit, and most good stories will have character growth. But these particular stories are more about setting out on a journey to perform a specific task. Number 8, Homogeneous Species. Grouping all members of a race into a single broad spectrum. All elves are beautiful and love nature. All dwarves are obsessed with gold and live underground. This also describes when all members of a certain race represent all good or all evil. An odd character of these races is often an outlier. Examples include Lord of the Rings, Star Trek, Dragonlance, Terminator. Basically means what it means. It's whenever you have all of somebody is good or all of somebody is evil, which gets into another trope later on. The Dritch Jordan stuff is pretty heavy on this, as far as the all bad drow race, which is kind of a pain to include in your story due to confusion and copyright, but that's not part of this. You want to have individual characters. It is really easy to group all of a particular race as one particular way. You need to learn as a storyteller to break it up. Not all of everybody is going to be the same way. Now, yes, they can all have similar tendencies, dwarves with their desire for gold and living in mountains. But you need to have individual characteristics between them all. If you're going to have them all just as one thing, they don't need to appear in your story at all. If they're going to appear, they need to be individual. Number 10, the Pseudo-European medieval setting. Basically, any feudal system governing a society where the world closely resembles medieval Europe. This is a common element in both fantasy and sci-fi worlds. Examples include The Lord of the Rings, Star Trek, all Arthurian tales, and Game of Thrones. With this, I don't really know why it's considered a trope. A lot of times people are taking these medieval European settings in order to build as a foundation. They use something that already happened or something that already works or worked at one time, and they build their story on top of it as a template. There's really nothing wrong with doing this. It's simply the fact that it's been overdone. If you're going to do it, try to break it up and make it seem like it's not this. Number 11. The Waiting Evil. An ancient evil that has been defeated long ago and locked away. Everything was going fine until something changed and the evil was released either by accident, natural causes, a loyal follower, or simply having served its time. Now that it's free, the world is going to pay. Examples include Harry Potter, Percy Jackson, Lord of the Rings, Power Rangers, Supernatural, not the current but the previous season of The Flash. Basically, it's anytime some big baddie has been locked away and is suddenly freed, and that's the cause of all the strife. I don't really know why this one's a cliche, other than the fact that it's obviously been done a lot of times, which I'm pretty sure is the only reason a lot of these end up on the list. As far as the Waiting Evil, if you can do it well, nobody's really going to say anything about it. It's just a matter of how you spin your story. I honestly would like to build a story that uses all of these. See if I can create something fun out of it. Number 12. The World That Never Progresses. A setting in which the world does not evolve in terms of technology, society, political, or cultural developments despite the passing of time. Examples include Ender's Game, Dragonlance, Game of Thrones, and most epic fantasy or post-apocalyptic. It's logical for evolution to happen. If a story starts in one place and several hundred years later, there is no change whatsoever, this is where you kind of run into this problem. Number 13, To the Rescue. Anytime all hope seems lost, the heroes are defeated, the good guys are going to lose, and suddenly the army arrives and saves the day. This trope is common in many stories, but like all tropes, it has a way of being used well, and many ways to be used not so well. Examples include The Lord of the Rings, The Maze Runner, Star Wars, Dragonlance. To give a couple examples of this in Lord of the Rings, one time it was done well, one time not so much. And I'm speaking to the movies, not the books in this regard. In the second movie, toward the beginning, whenever they get to Rohan, Gandalf tells Aragorn that he is leaving and to look for him at the first light of the third day and blah blah blah. That was all well and good. That was a promise that I will be back in this point in time, so if you can survive until then, everything will be okay. So Gandalf leaves, and then everything breaks loose. This was the time that was done extremely well. From the moment Gandalf left, the story did everything it possibly could to make you forget about Gandalf and what Gandalf was doing, and to forget that he was coming back. Everything that could go wrong went wrong, and then at the point in time whenever Aragorn mounts up and he rides out into the army and he's fighting with the intention of dying effectively, everything happens. He lasts those 3 days, and then you have that light at the dawn of the third day, and Gandalf shows up with army in tow. That time it was done really well. And the reason being is because there was a promise, there was the attempt to make you forget, there was the execution, and it just went beautifully. The time when this did not work well was in the third movie. Everything's looking grim, and then all of a sudden the boats show up, Aragorn jumps out with an army of ghosts, and they just sweep over and destroy everything. That time was not done well. That time felt like they were being pulled out of the fire just for the sake of being pulled out of the fire. There was no benefit or really anything to it. It was just, it happened. That was really, it was a thing with execution. Anytime that your heroes or your protagonists, anytime they're in danger, you need to consider how they're going to get out of the problem. Most of the time, they're going to need to solve this for themselves. If somebody shows up to rescue them, make sure that it is done in a specific way that is not going to make them feel like they are just being let out. Or if you're going to do it that way, you need to do it early on in the story so it's not as impactful. And then whenever something happens and they really need to be pulled out, nobody shows up to do it, which forces them to do it on their own. The 14th one, I've alluded to this a couple times already, but this is the black and white morality. The battle between good and evil. There are no shades of gray. Collateral damage is not acceptable. Good guys always wear white, bad guys always wear black. Examples include The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Dark Towers. There's multiple examples of this one, but it's basically any time that your good guys are always good, your bad guys are always bad, and there is no in between. You want to avoid this. As we know, the world exists in shades of gray. If you can incorporate that into your stories, you're going to have a more compelling and natural story. This goes back to stuff like the Rich Jordan books, where he's the one good when all the rest are bad. It's something you want to be careful of. But like I said earlier, any of these, even though they're tropes and cliches and all of that, if done well, you can do them in a way that they're not going to be tropes or cliches. And then a few tropes that I didn't mention. The ugly duckling is a trope where a character is perceived either by theirself or others as being unsightly to look upon. Usually after a brief experience, which typically happens during a montage, the character will gracefully walk down the stairs to display a beautiful exterior which will stun every spectator in the room. Then there's the outcast, any character who exists outside of society. Whether they want to or not is irrelevant. They will typically end up being accepted into the society, but usually against the wishes of some other party, and they usually have to undergo a quest to make it happen. And then lastly, star-crossed lovers. This is a very common story across all genres. Usually it's a tragic trope which places two characters at odds with one another. They often want to be close, but external alliances are keeping them apart. And most of the time they are going to suffer through the story at a gradual rate. Usually they will overcome all of these obstacles and they will get close. If it's a romantic story, then you know what happens. And then something will happen. One dude's best friend will get killed, or the intended for the female will be killed, and usually it's the guy's fault. And it's always a tragic tale that you can always identify whenever those happen. I mean, that's, Romeo and Juliet, West Side Story, Nomeo and Juliet. It happens quite a bit, and it doesn't have to be romance where that happens. It can happen in any genre. Any of these tropes can happen in any genre, but they appear quite frequent in fantasy. I think that's really all I've got to say for today. Thanks for listening if you're still here. If not, I'm sorry I lost you somewhere along the way. Anyway, I'm going to get out of here. I hope you guys, whether you are telling stories or writing books or creating video games, whatever you're using your stories for, I wish you the best of luck with it, and remember that you can use the tropes, the cliches, as long as they're done well. They will cease to be tropes and cliches. Do the best you can, and we'll see you guys next time. Have a good one. Bye.